Today I'm going to gush about 10 of my favorite books. I started jotting down my top 10 books of all time, and well, the list got a little out of control. But I've read between 1,500, 2,000 books in my lifetime, so I've read a lot of really great books that I want to talk about. A lot of these books I've never talked about on the channel. Today I'm going to talk about 50th place through 41st place because I do like to rank things. But these are 10 really amazing books that I love and I look forward to talking to you about. So this will be the first of 5 videos. That will just be a quick little video series of me talking about, gushing about, raving about, recommending some of the books that I really love. Before I get started with number 50, I want to talk about 2 honorable mentions. I want this top 50 to be as valid as it can be, if that makes any sense. So what I didn't want to have in this video was some recency bias. We know how that works. We read a book and it's amazing and then it's your favorite book forever. And then a couple months later you realize, well, maybe it's not my top 10, maybe it's top 20, top 50, and maybe it's not even 5-star after that. Who knows? But I have 2 books that I've read in the last 6 months that I did not deem eligible for this list that I just love, so I want to mention them. So my 2 honorable mentions are Memories of Ice by Steven Erikson, which is the 3rd book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It was remarkable. It's a book that the first time I tried to read it, I DNF'd, but I picked it up again a year and a half later and so glad because it was such a moving literary experience. I suspect 6 months from now, when I make this eligible for the list, it will be in my top 50. The other honorable mention is Lord of Emperors by Guy Gavriel Kay. This is the 2nd book of his Sarantine Mosaic duology. I love this book. I suspect this will also be a top 50 book for me as well. It's probably very high, maybe not even on this list, but on one of the later lists. But it's not eligible yet. But both of those authors, Steven Erikson and Guy Gavriel Kay, you will hear me gush about them at some point in these videos. One of them later in this video. Number 50 is The Terror by Dan Simmons. Now, The Terror is a perfect mashup of genres that Simmons is so great. You see by the title, you would suspect that this is a horror novel. And there are horror elements here. There are fantastical elements here. But this is primarily a work of historical fiction. And it takes an historical mystery and it gives the Dan Simmons solution to it. After I read The Terror, honestly, I wanted Dan Simmons to do a whole series of him shining a light on an historical mystery and coming up with some clever solution in novel form like he did with The Terror. The historical mystery at the heart of this is the Franklin expedition, which is 2 sailing ships that left England in the early 19th century, mid-19th century, looking for the Northwest Passage. And they disappeared without a trace. The Terror was the name of one of the ships, but it has to do with something that comes into play when they do embark upon the ice trying to find this Northwest Passage. It's a epic length work of historical fiction. It's a storytelling tour de force. Although I do have one more Dan Simmons book to talk about on this list. When people say that The Terror is their favorite work by Dan Simmons, I just kind of nod knowingly and will agree with them because The Terror is fantastic. Pick it up if you haven't read it. Number 49 is The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. If you were looking up in the corner here, you may have noticed that it was missing from the shelf, the H, Wheel of Time up there. The Shadow Rising is my favorite book in the Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. And this book series just has a soft spot in my heart because I took a big break from reading fantasy, probably about 18 years, where I didn't read much fantasy at all. And then when I read The Wheel of Time, this great blending of traditional fantasy with some modern elements, it brought me back into enjoying this genre that I love so much. It's become my favorite genre once again. And if it weren't for picking up The Wheel of Time, I don't know if a lot of the modern fantasy authors that I love right now would have been possible. So because of that, this is something that just has a fondness in my heart. And The Shadow Rising is my favorite book in the series. It is the 4th book in the series. And for me, this is when things got really, really good. And you saw how great the series was going to be. You saw some exploration of culture. You saw such depth of character that would continue throughout the series. And this is the one that I was just 100% all in with The Wheel of Time. And it remains my favorite of this book series. Number 48 is World Without End by Ken Follett. This is the sequel to Pillars of the Earth. And I hear a lot of people talk about Pillars of the Earth. You'll hear me talk about it in a future video, but I don't know why people don't talk about this one because it is such a worthy sequel. I can't say that about all of the Kingsbridge novels. I think frankly, that Follett started to lose some of the magic in the middle of A Column of Fire. But World Without End, I think, is a very, very worthy successor to Pillars of the Earth, which is many people's favorite books of all time. It's another epic length story of historical fiction. It's set 100 to 150 years after the events of Pillars of the Earth. You could read this by itself, but by the nature of this being a sequel, even with the big time jump, it does work best if you read the two books together. But in many ways, I think Follett's characterization is stronger in this book. And I think that I actually remember more of the details of this book than in Pillars of the Earth. There are some facets of Pillars that elevate it above this for me, but if someone told me they thought this was a better book than Pillars of the Earth, I don't think I'd argue with them too much. World Without End is a fantastic book, and I think is a great work of historical fiction. Again, epic length. You can tell right away I got 3 chunkers that I talked about on this list, but I do love this book, and if you've read it, I'd love to hear you talk about it in the comment section below. Number 47 is Daughter of the Empire by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wurts. This is the first book in the Empire trilogy, which is kind of an offshoot of Raymond E. Feist's Rift War saga, but it's set on the other side of the rift, which is this passage between worlds, and it could be read standalone, and I think you should read this series as a standalone. Daughter of the Empire is the first book in that series, and what is most remarkable about this work, which came out in the 1980s, is, for me, the world building and the culture and the setting is so remarkable. It's a very Eastern-inspired setting, and in this book we meet a young woman named Mara who's thrust to the head of her house. And these are all these noble houses, and duty and honor and things like that are important in this society. And what's great about this book is it's a very cool coming-of-age tale with a character who was not in a situation to take over her family's house. So she has to just rely upon her wits. She is very clever, she is very intelligent, but she has to rely upon that, as well as she has to rely upon the people around her that are loyal to her as she plays the game of houses. And if you think this is a ripoff from Game of Thrones, this came first. The Game of Houses in here is a worthy companion to the Game of Thrones, because this has some of the best political machinations I've read in the fantasy genre, from one of the best protagonists that I've read in the fantasy genre. The Empire trilogy is fantastic, and my favorite of them is Daughter of the Empire by Raymond E. Feist and Janny Wurts. Number 46 is Deadhouse Gates by Steven Erikson. Deadhouse Gates is the second book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. If you don't know that series, it's 10 big chunky books like this one, and it's a challenging read. He throws you in the middle of the action, and in many ways, even though this is the book 2 of a book series, it's a brand new thing because the first book took place on an entire different continent in this world-spanning story. So we get a lot of new characters here. What I love about Erikson is he gives you this really zoomed-in approach on these characters. And you don't always understand the big picture. But in this one, I felt it was a little easier to understand that big picture because at the heart of this is a military campaign. And if you're not a fan of military fantasy, you should still read this because, honestly, I'm not. That is not a subgenre of the fantasy genre that really appeals to me. But when it's done so well, like in Deadhouse Gates, you can't help but love it. There are some characters in here that you will love, and you will witness some epic moments in this. Even though it's a military campaign, you get some political maneuvering, you get some great magic in here, and some great that was amazing epic moments, which seems that's one of Erikson's calling cards, because all 3 of these Malazan books that I've read so far have had something that is just beyond the scope of epic storytelling. But Deadhouse Gates is a remarkable work, and this is the first time that I loved a book by Erikson, and I already talked about the other one, and we'll see as I continue this series how much my esteem grows for this author in this series. But Deadhouse Gates is definitely one of my favorite books. Number 45 is Gone Baby Gone by Dennis Lehane. Now, I'll be honest, even though crime fiction, I'm a huge fan of crime fiction, it's probably my 3rd favorite genre after fantasy and historical fiction. I don't feel crime fiction often reaches the heights that those genres can reach, just by the nature of the stories, but this one reaches the heights. And Gone Baby Gone is remarkable. For me, a work of crime fiction to be elevated to a favorites book list, for me, it has to have a depth of theme. And the 3rd act of this book is downright remarkable. And there's a heft and a weight to this story that just makes you feel everything the characters are feeling here. Lehane is at his best when he is just embracing gritty realism, which he does in this book. This is a tough story. It's about a child abduction and two detectives trying to find out where the child was taken and all the ramifications and repercussions from something like that. And at the end, you will feel very different having read this book, just like the characters are very different at the end of this book as they were from the beginning. Not Lehane's best, pretty close, because I have more Lehane to talk about on a future video. Number 44 is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Of all the authors deemed classic authors today, Steinbeck is my favorite. I'm slowly making my way through all of his works. I've read all of the big famous ones. This one and another one do appear on this list. And The Grapes of Wrath showcases, in addition to Steinbeck's just immaculate prose, his writing style is just incredible. In addition to that, the two things that this does so well that Steinbeck does very well. The first is he is the master, truly the master of just creating characters that critics call it the everyman. And it's very true. He creates very human characters that, as a reader, you can very easily see yourself in those situations. These are not larger-than-life characters. These are just real people. And in many ways, The Grapes of Wrath is the best depiction of those kinds of people in any book that he's written. Additionally, the one thing Steinbeck does very well is he likes putting his characters in peril. And he does that so well. In this book, we have some characters that are in destitution, just trying to survive the Dust Bowl, trying to survive the Great Depression in America, and they're trying to travel to California for greener pastures, both literally and figuratively. And the journey is remarkable. I've heard some reviewers say they didn't like the ending of this, but if you think about thematically what Steinbeck was telling, the stories that he was talking about, the perseverance of the characters, it's a picture-perfect ending. It's a picture-perfect book. And it's only 40 whatever on this list. My goodness, I've read some great books in my lifetime. The Grapes of Wrath being one of the best. Number 43 is Boy's Life by Robert McCammon. This is the only book on this list that I don't have a physical copy. I read it on my Kindle, and I have to give a disclaimer. If you read it on your Kindle, make sure the Kindle doesn't start the book at chapter 1, because there's a prologue. I was halfway through chapter 1, totally confused. Luckily, some people in the Discord told me about a prologue, and I realized that the Kindle file had opened up in chapter 1. Anyway, so don't miss the prologue, because one thing it tells you is this is a first-person omniscient storytelling technique, and it works really, really well. I hadn't experienced anything like that in quite some time, and McCammon just knocks it out of the park. It is one of the best coming-of-age stories I've ever read. And you see behind me my Stephen King shelf. He's one of my favorites because of that attribute of his storytelling. He does that very, very well. McCammon is a worthy companion with King, as far as I'm concerned. And this story is coming-of-age tale told from the young person's perspective. There's brilliant magical realism. I love that the stories like this, they always make me feel young when you get an intelligent kid who is helping his parents get through things. And I always love that. As a precocious child, I always connected to that kind of story. And as an adult, I still do, and it makes me feel nostalgic for when I was that precocious child. But Boy's Life is remarkable. What's even more remarkable is I've read 2 books by McCammon. They're both in this top 50. Why have I not read more McCammon? You should read McCammon. You should read Boy's Life. Number 42 is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This book is downright remarkable because of the writing. If you had to ask me, top 10 list of writers that have the greatest command of the English language and just simply words on the page are the best, I would start at the top, and it would be Charlotte Bronte, and I would have to struggle to consider anybody else in her category. This is a book that is so polished and I think so perfectly written that when I was reading it, I was just marveling at her use of the language. It felt to me like she spent a day on every paragraph because each sentence had the perfect structure, the perfect word choice, flowed into the next sentence perfectly. The paragraphs flowed into chapters. The chapters flowed into a remarkable book. What is also remarkable is this is not my kind of story. This is a kind of a Victorian romance novel. Not my thing, but when something is done so well here, can't help but love it. I can't help but have just fond memories of this. And I've been afraid to pick up anything else by Charlotte Bronte because I put this book on such a high pedestal. So if you're just simply a fan of the written word and you just love authors that have a great command of the language and can just flat out write, look no further than Charlotte Bronte. Look no further than Jane Eyre. I can't believe this is only 42 on my list because when I started jotting down my top 10, this was on the list of a potential top 10. Just shows that I've read some really remarkable things in my lifetime, including Jane Eyre. Number 41 is Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb. This is the first book in the Tawny Man trilogy. And this was the 7th book that I read by Hobb. And this was the first time that I said very clearly, this is one of my favorite fantasy authors. And by the time I finished this trilogy, she was my favorite fantasy author and still is my favorite fantasy author. Fool's Errand is remarkable. In many ways, it's a sequel to the Farseer trilogy. And that's been a first-person narrative for 3 books, and this is the 4th book where we have Fitz as a character narrating the story. But it's set 15 years later. And the first 150 pages of this is one of the most remarkable things I've ever read. And nothing happens to the plot. 150 pages into this book, I told somebody, I said, the plot has moved absolutely nowhere, and I don't know if I've ever been happier reading a book. That's how amazing Robin Hobb is as an author. You're getting caught up in the story, you're getting reacquainted with Fitz and seeing how he is and what's going on with him and the people around him, and it's remarkable. And this book thrusts him into just the 6 duchies and kingdom politics, and he has to save the world once again, as it were, and it's a remarkable book. A lot of people call this their favorite in the Tawny Man trilogy. It's not. I'll talk about that one later, but it is one of my favorite books of Robin Hobb, and the first 150 pages might be my favorite passage that Hobb wrote in any of her books. She is a favorite. They call her Queen Hobb for good reason. Fool's Errand, number 41 on my list, and the last one I'm going to talk about today. So, hey, this was a gush fest. If you don't like any of these books, I don't want to talk to you. Seriously, though, I'd love to talk with you, the things that you love about these books. Tell me about Jane Eyre. Tell me what I should read about McCammon next. Some of these authors you're going to see again in future videos. I can't promise these will come out in order. I'll get these out over the next few months, but I hope that you like the first video in this 5-video series of my favorite books. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Till next time, goodbye.